Before we start, take a moment to like and subscribe. The temple courtyard was a place of calm on this particular morning. The sun was warming the air, and a large crowd had gathered around Jesus. He was sitting on the ground teaching the people, his voice gentle and clear. He spoke of love, forgiveness, and the way God sees the heart, not just the outside. The crowd was captivated. Suddenly, a storm of angry voices and commotion broke the peace. A group of stern, angry-faced men, the religious leaders, pushed their way through the crowd. They were dragging a young woman with them. Her hair was messy, her clothes were torn, and her eyes were filled with absolute terror and shame. They stopped right in front of Jesus and threw her to the ground at his feet. She stumbled, and a cloud of dust kicked up around her. The leader of the group, a man with a cold, hard voice, spoke for them all. "Teacher," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm, "this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. Our law, the law of Moses, says we must stone people like her to death. What do you say?" The air became heavy with tension. Everyone knew this was a trap. They weren't asking for an honest answer. They were trying to ruin Jesus. If he said, "Stone her," he would go against his own teachings of mercy. But if he said, "Let her go," he would be seen as breaking the sacred law. The angry men stood ready, their hands already clutching heavy stones. The woman on the ground was a pawn in their cruel game. The woman's breath was quick and shallow. Her body trembled, not just from the cold dust on the ground, but from the raw fear of her impending death. The men's eyes were narrowed with a cold, sharp hate, fixed on Jesus, ready to pounce on his answer. The crowd was completely silent, a tense audience waiting to witness a fatal error. They expected him to argue, to try to reason with them, to get caught up in a debate about the law. But Jesus didn't do any of those things. He didn't answer right away. He didn't look at the angry men, or at the scared woman, or at the silent crowd. He simply bent down. He lowered himself to her level, getting close to the dusty ground, a gesture of profound humility that was entirely unexpected. With his finger, he began to write. The sound was a soft, steady scraping of his finger against the tiny pebbles and dry dirt. It was the only sound for what felt like an eternity. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't scribble. He moved his finger slowly, deliberately, creating lines and shapes in the dust. The accusers grew visibly impatient. "What do you say? What should we do with her?" Their voices were louder now, laced with frustration. They were ready for a swift resolution, a public spectacle, not this strange, slow ritual. The silence, punctuated only by the soft scraping sound, was more unsettling than a shout. It was a silence that held immense power, demanding attention and forcing everyone to look at something they didn't understand. Was he writing down her name? Was he sketching something? Or was he somehow writing a sentence that would change everything? The silent, thoughtful action of a man writing in the dirt made the loud, aggressive demands of his accusers seem small and foolish. The tense silence stretched on. The accusers, who had been so sure of their trap, now looked restless. They were ready for a stoning, not a quiet lesson. They were starting to look foolish in front of the crowd. The sun was rising higher, and the morning air, once so cool, now felt suffocating. They looked at each other, their confident smiles replaced by frowns of confusion and irritation. What was this man doing? Was he mocking them? Finally, Jesus stood up. His movements were calm and slow. He looked directly at the angry men, his face serious but not angry. The crowd held its breath, and the tension returned, sharper than before. Everyone was leaning in, expecting a final, dramatic statement. "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." He said the words in a regular voice. He wasn't yelling or dramatic. But those simple words had the force of a thunderclap. The smug expressions on the men's faces instantly fell away. Their clever trap had just exploded in their faces. Each one of them, deep down, knew they had their own secrets, their own mistakes, their own sins. They were not perfect. Then Jesus bent down again and went back to writing in the sand. This was the moment of complete power. He didn't need to say another word. His first act had made them pause, and his second act of returning to the writing forced them to look inside themselves. He was telling them, without speaking, that the person they really needed to worry about was themselves. He wasn't just a teacher anymore. He was a mirror, reflecting their own flaws back at them. The stones in their hands suddenly felt heavy with guilt and shame. They weren't just rocks for punishing someone else. They were a reminder of their own brokenness. The oldest man in the group was the first to act. His name was Simon, a man who had dedicated his life to the law, but in his heart, he carried the weight of a lie he had told to save his reputation. The stone in his hand, once a weapon of justice, now felt like a lead weight, a symbol of his own hypocrisy. He looked down at it, then at the dust where Jesus was writing. Slowly, his fingers loosened their grip. The heavy stone slipped from his hand and fell to the ground with a soft thud. It was a small sound, but in the silence that had followed Jesus' words, it was as loud as a thunderclap. He didn't look back at Jesus or the woman. He simply turned and began to walk away, melting into the outer edge of the crowd. The quiet thud was a signal. A man standing next to him, a furious accuser just moments before, shifted his weight uncomfortably. He had secretly cheated a merchant in a business deal last week. The stone felt hot in his palm. He watched Simon walk away, and a wave of shame washed over him. He, too, let his stone drop, the clatter on the packed earth sounding like a whisper of his own guilt. He followed Simon's path, then another man and another. It was a domino effect of silent defeat. The cacophony of angry shouts had been replaced by a chorus of small, distinct clatters as the stones were released. Each stone that hit the ground was a small surrender, an admission of personal failure. The men who had come with such righteous fury now had nothing to say. They simply lowered their heads and began to disperse. They didn't run, they didn't hurry. They just walked away, their purpose gone, their anger deflated. The woman on the ground had been listening to the sounds. She had braced herself for the impact of the first stone, her whole body tensed for the end. But the sound she heard was not a crack of stone against flesh, but a dull thud. Then another, and another. She slowly lifted her head, her terror giving way to a bewildered hope. She saw legs moving, men turning their backs. The mob was not closing in, it was retreating. The angry faces, once so close and menacing, were now distant and blurred as they walked away. Soon, the only sound left was the scuffing of sandals as the last person walked away, leaving behind a field of scattered stones. The crowd, which had been so quick to judge and watch, had also dissolved. The onlookers, too, had felt the sting of Jesus' words and now respectfully gave the scene a wide berth. The only ones left were Jesus and the woman, still kneeling in the dust. She was no longer a victim surrounded by a mob. She was just a person sitting in the dust, her life saved by a simple act of mercy and a quiet message written in the sand. When Jesus stood up again, he looked at the woman with kindness in his eyes. He wasn't looking at her in a way that judged her. He was looking at her like she was a person, no different from him. The shame that had been on her face moments before was now replaced with a dawning sense of hope. The heavy burden of her past had not been erased, but the immediate threat of death had been removed. She was no longer an object of public spectacle, but a living, breathing soul. "Woman," he said gently, his voice carrying the same calm authority as his earlier words, "where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" She slowly looked up and saw that the angry faces were gone. The silence was no longer heavy with tension, but felt light and full of a new possibility. "No one, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then neither do I condemn you," he said. "Go now and leave your life of sin." He wasn't excusing what she had done. He was giving her a new start, a second chance. He was showing her a way out of her old life, a way to be free from her shame. He didn't tell her to go and be perfect right away. He just told her to go and start over. And she did. She got up and walked away, no longer a victim of a mob, but a person with a fresh start. The words in the sand remain a mystery, but the message of forgiveness and second chances is as clear as day.